Correct.
Well, Professor Urgesi, thank you very much for joining us today to give you the opportunity of describing your research under the John F. Templeton Foundation project on the brain and religion. We really appreciate you coming, taking the time out from your busy schedule to join us. So why don't you go ahead and talk to us just briefly, and then we'll ask questions and have a conversation basically about your project, keeping in mind that everybody from academics to regular people who are not academics going to the website to see what's going on. So as plain speaking as you can be, the better for us. So thank you again for joining us, and tell us the name and what you're doing on your project.
Okay, thank you for this invitation, and I'm happy to present what we are trying to do in this project. This is a collaborative project from different groups from Italy. I'm the PI of the project. I'm Cosimo Urgesi. I'm from the University of Udine, and I'm a professor of developmental psychology. And then there are other team members from the University of Udine, Alessandra Finisguerra, and also from the University of Bologna, Vincenzo Romei, and from the University La Sapienza of Rome, Gabriele Fusco. Our project is about searching for the neural foundation of spirituality and religiosity in the predictive coding of the internal and external world. So we are trying to investigate religiosity and spirituality within a predictive brain coding approach. In this approach, the brain is not seen as a passive receiver of information from the environment, but it is seen as an active predictor of what is going on in the world, both in the internal world about our bodily states and about the external world, what is going on to be captured by our senses from the external world. In this sense, the brain actively tries to reduce the error which comes out from the comparison between what it is expecting from the internal and external world and what is perceived continuously, what is coming from the world. So the brain goes into the environment with expectations about what it is going to grasp from that, and try to find confirmation about these expectations. When these expectations are not confirmed, there is an error that needs to update the expectations. In this sense, people may vary in their tendency to rely more on the expectations or more on what is coming from the world in terms of sensorial information. And we are trying to test a hypothesis about these inter-individual differences in religiosity and spirituality related to these relying more on the expectations or on sensorial information. So in this hypothesis, people who tend to believe more or to be more spiritual tend to rely more on prior expectation than on sensorial information. While people who tend to be more empiricist tend to rely more on sensorial information and prediction error. So this is the basic idea of the project, and which is also complemented by a second idea, which allows us also to differentiate two very related constructs, religiosity and spirituality, trying to relate them to inter-individual differences in perceiving the external world which is more related to religiosity, or to a inter-individual difference in the way we perceive the internal world, which is more related to spirituality. In other words, while people who tend to be more religious rely more on prior when they perceive the external world, inter-individual differences in spirituality may be related to the relying on prior expectation when we perceive the internal world.
So, Cosimo, it's great that you're using this predictive processing framework to probe religiosity and religiousness and so forth. You know, one obvious question that comes up quickly is for people who claim not to be religious, you know, obviously they rely on their priors, you know, so what's the idea, what would be the explanation in that case, you know?
Yeah, my personal idea about this is that in this sense, religiosity can be seen as an attitude that people have in being convinced about a certain idea. Even for people who claim that, I mean, not they are not religious, but that God does not exist, for example, they are very much relying on their prior, on their expectation, because there is no sensorial evidence explaining and giving proof that God does not exist. And so in this sense, this kind of atheistic religiosity can be also go to into the same direction.
So the claim is not that religiousness is equivalent to sort of rigid priors, right? The claim is that if you are interested in individual differences in levels of religiosity, on average, people who call themselves religious will tend to rely more on priors rather than the predictive error or the sensory feedback.
Exactly.
Than
yes.
People who are not as religious.
Yeah, and also in this project we are also testing the causative relationship between relying more on prior expectation and become more religious or spiritual, and also the opposite. So if we push people to rely more on prior with a behavioral manipulation or also with neuroscientific manipulation, we expect that this should induce effects also in how they perceive themselves to be religious or spiritual. So in a sense, this also explains for how experience can change our way to be religious or spiritual.
Good, yeah. Can you talk a bit about the methods that you're going to be using?
Yeah, basically we are using obviously behavioral methods, which are very important for a psychologist to clarify and operationalize a construct. In this case, the constructs are very complex, and so we need hard work also to rely on very stable and reliable paradigm. And then from a neuroscientific point of view, we will use electroencephalographic recordings and transcranial alternating current stimulation. We are using electroencephalographic recording because there are some hints that different processes in the predictive brain rely on different waves that can be different brain oscillations of the signals that we can record from the scalp. So there are some frequency bands in the oscillation that we can see in the electroencephalographic recording that reflect more priors, expectations, and those are in the range of between 14 Hertz or between 14 30 Hertz. They are called alpha and beta band, while higher frequency oscillations seem to reflect the processing of the prediction error. So in this sense, we will try to find fingerprints in the brain for these two types of processing. So we expect to see the higher alpha and beta bands oscillations when people tend to rely more on priors, and we expect higher oscillation in the gamma band when people tend to rely more on sensorial information and in the processing of a prediction error.
Is this high density EEG or just a standard like sleep montage or?
Is 64 channels EEG. Yeah. And then also coupled with the high density, also analysis of the signal both in the spatial and temporal domain. The second method that we are going to use is a neuromodulation technique, transcranial alternating current stimulation, which provide low intensity alternating current on specific regions of the scalp, and it has been shown that this stimulation can entrain brain activity. So if you give stimulation in the alpha or beta band, you expect to increase the power of these oscillations, and we expect that this should increase the relying on prior expectations. On the opposite,
when you stimulate those, try to stimulate the brain, and when they're in those bands, is it over a particular region?
Yeah, actually, in general, you can stimulate any region, and now we are also we want to use an high definition stimulation that can be more focal rather than standard stimulation montage in which you have to put the electrodes on different parts of the brain. In our case, we want to focus on two areas which are supposedly involved in exteroceptive processing, basically the visual cortex, and we have some studies, some findings from our collaborators that oscillations in the visual cortex reflect the relying of people on expectation or on sensorial information, and the other region will be the inferior frontal gyrus, which the opercular part, as a hint with a system that is expected to be involved more in the processing of internal bodily information.
Okay. Jordan?
When you're going to be studying your participants, will they be younger, sort of college student participants, or what's going to be the nature of the people you're going to recruit for your studies?
Yeah, they will be the standard white psychology students, which have been the basis of psychological studies, and they will in the range between 18 25, very young students, university students. This is a convenient sample, actually. We expect to recruit them from Catholic culture area, and so in this sense, to have an uniform population, we will also screen their religious attitude and tradition.
Can I ask another question about the EEG stuff? There's some literature that suggests theta activity to be particularly, especially over medial temporal lobe, to be especially important for, like emotionally significant stuff, and maybe religiosity. So is there any interest in your group to look at, those particular regions as well?
Yeah, the limitations for the area that we want to target is related to the specific nature of the technique. Obviously, with the transcranial stimulation methods, you can go only on the lateral surface of the cortex. So
I see.
we will focus on that. Obviously, yeah, medial temporal regions have been related to religiosity and also, for example, in the case of seizures. But actually, in our previous studies, we have also found a strong involvement of lateral surface cortex, including the parietal cortex and
Yes.
the frontal cortex in the lateral surface. So obviously, this is a limitation. We need other techniques to address the medial areas of the brain. And actually, we have used previously one of these techniques, which is the transcutaneous vagal nerve stimulation, by which, with the stimulation of the tragus of the ear, you can access the auricular branch of the vagus nerve, which seems to be related to medial regions of the
Yes,
brain.
indeed. Yeah, I'd be very interested in seeing more work in that area. Just before turning it back to Jordan, there's a larger question, I think, and it's kind of linked with some of your previous work, I think. That is, you just mentioned parietal lobe and modulation of parietal lobe, and then there's, of course, experiments of nature with patients have lesions parietal lobe, and it seems to be, especially a multi-sensory integration area, you know, in the parietal region, seems to be linked with changes in the sense of self and you know, transcendence, self-transcendence, you know, psychometrically measured. It's called self-transcendence. So I was wondering, you know, what's your take on that region and its role in the sense of self and religiosity and so on, given your previous work and now this?
Yeah. Actually, as you mentioned, the parietal cortex has been since ever critically involved in multisensorial integration,
Yeah.
particularly related to the body, but maybe also for the external space,
Yes.
for attentional process. And what is typically observed when you have a lesion in that area is, particularly in the right hemisphere, is that you miss the link between the self and your body. So when they stimulated the temporoparietal junction in a patient with seizure, they found out-of-body experience.
Yes.
And also in our previous study, we found that after a lesion, brain tumor of this area of the temporoparietal cortex, you have an increase of self-transcendence, which we have interpreted as a disconnection between the body and the self. In this sense, this project tries to give a mechanicistic explanation of what happens, why there is this disconnection. And what we say is that there is the disconnection because the brain does not rely anymore so much on the incoming sensorial information from the body, but only about it relies on prior expectation. In this sense, there is a detachment. The self relies only on the expectation and not on the sensorial information coming from the body. And this explained the effect.
So the brain can't use the internal sensory feedback to compute differences between expectancies and what, so that source of predictive error is no longer available. So it relies only on prior.
Exactly.
But why does that yield self-transcendence, I wonder?
Yeah, because you transcend your physical body. You project the self in some scenarios that are not anymore linked to what you perceive. So you can transcend the self from your body, you can transcend the self from space and time, and so the external world in this sense. And you see in something that is not anymore related to the concrete reality that you
I
can
think
perceive.
that's fascinating. That's over to you, Jordan.
Well, so your participants, some of them will be practicing religious people, and some will simply have knowledge about religion, but don't necessarily practice
Yeah,
it.
I think this will be.
Right. And I'm wondering what you would see regarding your studies as the essential difference to pull out between these two kinds of people, where they, let's say they both have religious knowledge, but one practices. And what is going to be, what are you going, so out of that, you distill a difference of some kind, either on a cognitive basis or an emotional basis, maybe. And so could you talk a little bit about that? And then how you see that difference influencing your studies?
Yeah, we expect great variations of practice, if not in the tradition in religious education among our participants, but we expect great differences in the extent they practice, and which it won't be as a dichotomic variable, but you will see people that never go to the church, or people that go for Easter or Christmas, or people that go every Sunday or every day who are involved. So we will take it as a continuous measure, and we will control it for our effects, and also we will control for two important dimensions of personality, which are related to the autistic traits and to the schizotypical traits. In relation to the predictive brain, people with autism seem to rely too much on sensorial information and prediction error. And also they tend to be less religious, okay, in terms of other projects.
Yeah. Less traditionally religious. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And while people with the schizotypical traits tend to rely too much, maybe on prior, and this can explain, since the very old explanation of Freud and others, also their delusions, and they rely on prior, and they often show religious, hyper-religious behavior. And so we will take this measure not as a signature of a pathology, but as traits in the general population. And we expect our students to show different traits, which should also explain their involvement in religious practice.
So in your own words, how do you place this, the project you're currently doing in the context of your goals here? So what are your goals in studying religious belief in the brain? What do you want to sort of learn and then transmit to others?
Well, I started studying this topic some years ago, and it is not easy, I must admit, because it is some very difficult argument. People can be very skeptics, but I got the belief that this is too much important aspect of our thinking, behavior, and feeling, and cognitive neuroscience cannot disregard this aspect, because without studying it, we cannot really reach a real understanding of how we approach ourselves and how we approach the world. So in the case of the previous studies, I really realized that that studying self-transcendent phenomena is crucial to understand how we reach a perception of the self and understand all these phenomena. And the same is regarding how we perceive the external world. It is important to understand how we attribute to this phenomena in the external world, an interpretation that is not coming from our sensorial information, but is coming from our expectation. Otherwise, we cannot understand what is perception in general. So it is not just an aspect of cognitive neuroscience, but it is pivotal to understand really how we perceive the world, because it is an important aspect of our behavior. And this can also open a window into better understanding of interindividual differences. So why people tend to be more religious and other people tend to be less religious, and so on for spirituality.
Well, given the seemingly importance of studying religion, why do you think more people don't do it? Why are there not more investigations of brain and religion?
I think that it is an historical issue. I mean, maybe 40 years ago, it would be difficult to study language from neurological from a point of view, and it won't be so. It is not anymore so far away from traditional cognitive neuroscience, and I think it will be the same also for cognitive neuroscience of religious cognition. We need some more, maybe it is more complex, no? Studying vision is, maybe vision is a more simple construct to operationalize than language, and religiosity is even more complex than language.
I hear a similar thing when I talk to other scientists who are starting to work in this area, that it seems silly not to investigate religion with, standard cognitive neuroscience of cognition tools, because religion is so central to billions of people's lives that it seems silly not to apply the standard scientific tools in this area as well. As evidence is accumulating that for religious people who, religion is also incredibly important for things like health and well-being and productivity and generativity, so not only is it crucial to understand human nature, studying religion is central to human nature, it has been for thousands of years, but also it seems, at least for people who are religious, it's crucial for their well-being. So it seems like it's, the scientific payoff is going to be big for studying this phenomena, with standard scientific tools and paradigms. So
yeah, exactly, for translational issues, it will be
the translational
important.
issues will be there, of course, as they are in every other domain. But one more broad question, general question that we're asking all of our interviewees for this series of interviews is, where do you see where would you like to see the field going, this emerging scientific field? Where would you like to see it go, or what does it need, or what is it doing wrong? What is it doing right? I know it's a very broad question, but
yeah, I think that a big step that we need to do in this domain is to go beyond the specific faith traditions of our culture or Western culture. I think that we will do a big step when we will be able to put together different faith traditions, and if we can see the same thing, then we are studying really what we want to study. Otherwise, we are studying just rituals and specific beliefs. While if we find what characterize religiosity across traditions, this will be a great issue.
There's been a fair amount of study done on Buddhists, right? Neuroscience study on the Buddhist tradition, but maybe that's been in Western practitioners of Buddhism.
Exactly. Yeah, that is more often the westernized Buddhism, actually, which is basically more related to meditation than to beliefs.
Good. Anything else, Jordan?
No, anything else you want to add, Cosimo?
No, I think that yeah, I have to thank you for and Templeton Foundation for supporting this grant. As I was mentioning at the beginning, it is not so easy to get funds for these studies, and this was also one of your incipit in the call for proposal. But I think it is important also to put together different researchers in order to support each other and share some methodology and have a team approach to this.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Cosimo. You're doing a fascinating work, great cutting edge work, and it's a pleasure to be working with you on this stuff.
Thank you very much. I'm enthusiastic about that too.
All right, everybody. Thanks, everybody.